Every few weeks, social media explodes with videos of young Indians on the streets. Students demanding justice, aspirants protesting recruitment delays, citizens marching against new laws, and environmental activists blocking roads, women organizing candlelight vigils. Sometimes the police allows these demonstrations. Sometimes they disperse them. Sometimes protesters are detained, sometimes interest services are suspended. And every single time the same debate erupts. Do we actually have a right to protest in India? Can the government stop a protest before it even begins? Can the police refuse permission? Can roads be blocked? Can Section 144 be imposed? Or can people be arrested simply for protesting? Or is protest one of the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution? If you've ever opened Instagram, X or YouTube during a major protest, you've probably seen thousands of people confidently answering these questions. The problem is, most of them are only telling one part of the story, because the truth is far more complicated. The Constitution protects your freedom. The government has powers to regulate that freedom, and the Supreme Court has spent decades trying to balance the two. But to understand where that balance lies today, we first need to understand how we got here. Because there was a time when Indians had no legal right to protest at all. There was a time when criticizing the government could land you in prison. There was a time when even printing the wrong newspaper article could make you a criminal. And there was also a time when millions of Indians deliberately broke those very laws in what became one of the history's greatest freedom movements. So, in this documentary, we are going on a journey across nearly 3,000 years. We'll begin in ancient India, travel through the East India Company, witness the birth of the freedom struggle, watch Gandhi transform protest into a weapon stronger than violence, and see how the Constitution tried to protect this freedom and understand the landmark Supreme Court judgments that define it today. We'll finally answer the question that matters most in modern India. What exactly can an Indian citizen legally do during a protest? And what powers does the government legally have to stop it? Because in a democracy, every citizen should know not only their rights but also the limits to those rights. And so, let's begin. Not in the Supreme Court, not in the Parliament, but in an India that existed long before either of them. Before we begin discussing constitutions and courts, we must first understand an important distinction that is often overlooked. Human beings have always resisted authority. Throughout history, whenever rulers imposed excessive taxes, acted unjustly, or ignored the suffering of their people, resistance inevitably followed. Farmers refused to pay revenue, soldiers mutinied against their commanders, tribal communities defended their forests, merchants opposed oppressive regulations, and ordinary people sometimes rose in rebellion against those who governed them. Resistance, therefore, is almost as old as civilization itself. A right, however, is something entirely different. A right is not simply an action that people choose to perform. A right exists only when the law itself recognizes that actions as legitimate and protects individuals from being punished merely because they exercised it. In other words, the existence of protests throughout history does not necessarily mean that people possess a legal right to protest. This distinction becomes much more clearer if we imagine ourselves living in India more than 2,000 years ago. Suppose you were an ordinary farmer during the Mauryan Empire and a local official demanded taxes that your family could no longer afford to pay. This was after a failed harvest. Could you gather hundreds of fellow villagers, march towards the capital carrying banners, publicly denounce the king's policies and demand that the government withdraw this decision? The answer is almost certainly a no. But not because rulers are completely indifferent to public opinion, but because the relationship between the ruler and the subject was fundamentally different from the relationship that exists today within a democratic government and its citizens. Ancient India was certainly not devoid of institutions through which grievances could be expressed. The Vedic texts describe assemblies known as the Sabha and the Samiti, where matters concerning the community could be discussed. Village councils resolved disputes, represented local interests, and served as important centers of local administration. Centuries later, Chanakya in the Arthashastra repeatedly advised kings to pay close attention to public dissatisfaction, warning that corruption, excessive taxation, and administrative injustice could ultimately weaken the stability of the kingdom itself. Emperor Ashoka, after embracing the policies of Dhamma, instructed his officials to remain accessible so that grievances brought by ordinary people could be heard without unnecessary delay. These examples demonstrate that wise rulers understood the importance of listening to their subjects, but they should not be mistaken for evidence of a legally protected freedom to oppose the government. A king might choose to hear complaints because it was politically prudent or morally desirable, yet that was very different from acknowledging that every individual possessed an independent right to publicly challenge state authority. This remained broadly true across much of the ancient and medieval Indian history. Different dynasties adopted different methods of governance, and many rulers were praised for their justice while others became notorious for oppression. But nowhere do we find the modern constitutional principle that citizens may peacefully criticize the government without fear of punishment simply because the law protects that freedom. For thousands of years, therefore, India witnessed resistance, revolts, and rebellions, but it did not possess what we today recognize as a legal right to protest. Ironically, the government that attempted most aggressively to suppress public dissent would eventually become the catalyst for the birth of that very right. When the East India Company gradually transformed itself from a trading corporation into the ruler of a vast territory, it also began to regulate speech, public meetings, newspapers, and political opposition in ways that India had never before experienced. It was under colonial rule that the struggle for political freedom and the struggle for the right to dissent became inseparable. That is where the modern history of India's right to protest truly begins, and it is to the East India Company that we now turn. When the East India Company first ever arrived in India at the beginning of the 17th century, it had no intention of ruling a country. It was quite simply a trading company. Like several other European companies of the time, its objective was to purchase Indian spices, textiles, indigo, silk, and other valuable goods, transport them to Europe, and make enormous profits. The Mughal emperor granted it a permission to establish trading factories along the coast, and for many decades, the company remained just another commercial enterprise operating within the vast Mughal empire. Yet history has a peculiar way of changing course through seemingly ordinary events. As the Mughal Empire weakened during the 18th century, regional kingdoms emerged across the subcontinent, often competing with one another for territory and influence. The East India Company soon realized that military power could secure profits far more effectively than trade alone. Victories at the battles of Plassey in 1757 and the Battle of Buxar in 1764 transformed the company from a merchant into a ruler. By acquiring the Diwani rights over Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha, the company gained the authority to collect revenue from millions of Indians. A private corporation had now become the government of one of the richest regions of the world. For the people of India, this transformation had profound consequences. Like traditional Indian rulers, whose legitimacy often depended upon custom, religion, or hereditary authority, the East India Company possessed no such historical relationship with the people it governed. Its primary obligation was not towards its subjects, but towards the shareholders in Britain who expected growing profits every year. Revenue collection became increasingly aggressive because of this. Taxes rose, and local officials frequently abused their authority. Famines devastated entire provinces, yet revenue demands often continued with little reduction. It did not take long for the resistance to emerge. Across different parts of India, peasants refused to pay excessive taxes. Tribal communities defended their forests and traditional ways of life, and local rulers challenged the company's expanding control. The Sannyasi and Fakir rebellion in Bengal during the late 18th reflected growing resentment against the company. Across different parts of India, peasants refused to pay excessive taxes. Tribal communities defended their forests and traditional ways of life, and local rulers challenged the company's expanding control. The Sannyasi and Fakir rebellion in Bengal during the late 18th century reflected growing resentment against the company's policies after the Bengal famine. In southern India, the Polygar Wars saw local chieftains resist British authority. The Paika rebellion in 1817 in Odisha erupted when traditional military landholders lost their privilege under the company administration. Tribal uprisings, including the Coal Rebellion and later the Santal Rebellion, revealed that discontent was spreading far beyond the educated elite. These movements were undoubtedly protests against injustice, but they were not recognized as lawful exercises of a citizen's freedom. From the company's perspective, they were threats to its authority and were met with military force, executions, confiscation of property, and severe punishments. The objective was not to negotiate with dissent, but to eliminate it before it could spread. As the 19th century progressed, however, a new form of resistance began to emerge. English education introduced many Indians to ideas that had transformed Europe and America. Encountered concepts such as liberty, representative government, freedom of expression, and the rule of law. Newspapers written by Indian editors began discussing the government policies. Public meetings became more common. Lawyers, teachers, journalists, merchants started asking a dangerous question. If the British claimed to value liberty in their own country, why were the Indians denied the same freedom? The company quickly realized that ideas could be as dangerous as weapons. A rebellion could be crushed with soldiers, but an idea, once it spreads from one newspaper to another or from one public meeting to the next, was much harder to suppress. The British administration therefore began developing legal mechanisms to regulate speech, monitor publications, and control public gatherings. These measures did not yet create the elaborate colonial legal systems that would later emerge under the Crown rule, but they revealed an important shift. The government no longer feared that only armed rebellion, it also feared public opinion. The tension between authority and dissent was steadily increasing, and by the middle of the 19th century, it would explode into one of the most significant events in Indian history. The revolt of 1857 was far more than a military mutiny. It fundamentally changed how the British viewed political opposition in India. After suppressing the uprising, they became convinced that even small acts of dissent could eventually threaten their rule. The result would be an unprecedented expansion of laws designed to regulate speech, public meetings, newspapers, and political activity. Ironically, these attempts to silence India would unite Indians in ways that British had never anticipated. The revolt of 1857 lasted more than a year, but its consequences would shape India for almost a century. For the British, it was a traumatic experience. Thousands of soldiers had rebelled. Large parts of northern and central India had slipped out of their control. Ordinary civilians, local rulers, peasants, artisans, and religious leaders had, in many places, joined the uprising. Although the British eventually suppressed the revolt with overwhelming military force, they drew one lesson that would influence every policy they made thereafter. Never allow dissent to grow unchecked. The British no longer viewed political dissatisfaction as a temporary administrative problem. They began to see it as a threat to the very existence of their empire in India. The first major change came in 1858. The East India Company was abolished. The governance of India passed directly into the hands of the British Crown. Queen Victoria's proclamation promised justice, equal treatment before the law, and respect for Indian traditions. On paper, it sounded like the beginning of a more humane administration. In practice, however, the British state became far more organized in monitoring and controlling public opposition. One of the most effective tools of resistance had always been the written word. Newspapers were becoming increasingly popular among educated Indians, and editors were beginning to question government policies openly. Articles criticized excessive taxation, administrative failures, racial discrimination, and the exclusion of Indians from positions of authority. To the colonial government, this was deeply unsettling. A newspaper could carry an idea across thousands and hundreds of kilometers in a matter of days, reaching people whom the government could neither predict nor control. The British therefore began tightening their control over the press. Perhaps the most notorious example was the Vernacular Press Act of 1857, introduced by Lord Lytton. It specifically targeted newspapers published in Indian languages rather than English. The government believed that vernacular newspapers reached a much larger Indian audience and therefore posed a greater political threat. Under this law, officials could demand security deposits from publishers, confiscate printing presses, and suppress publications that criticized the government, often without the safeguards available to ordinary courts. The message was unmistakable. Criticizing the government was becoming increasingly dangerous. Yet, the British did not stop there. In the 1870s, another law had quietly entered the Indian Penal Code. It was Section 124A, better known as the Law of Sedition. The wording of this law was remarkably broad. It made it a criminal offence to bring or attempt to bring into hatred or contempt, or to excite dissatisfaction towards the government established by law in India. Although the British argued that the law was necessary to maintain public order, its practical effect was much wider. Political speeches, newspaper articles, pamphlets, public criticism of colonial rule could all potentially fall within its scope. The punishment was severe, extending to imprisonment for years. This was no ordinary criminal law. It became one of the most powerful legal weapons in the colonial government's arsenal. Some of India's greatest freedom fighters would eventually stand trial under this very provision. Bal Gangadhar Tilak was prosecuted more than once for sedition because of articles published in his newspaper. During one trial, the British argued that even if his writings did not directly call for violence, they encouraged dissatisfaction against the government. Years later, Mahatma Gandhi himself would be charged under the same law. Standing before the judges in 1922, Gandhi did not deny the accusation. Instead, he declared that Section 124A was the prince among the political sections of the Indian Penal Code designed to suppress the liberty of the citizen. It remains one of the most famous courtroom statements in Indian legal history. But sedition was only one part of a much larger system. Public meetings were increasingly monitored. Political organizations came under surveillance. The police maintained intelligence networks to identify influential activities. Printing presses were inspected, letters were intercepted. The colonial state gradually built a sophisticated machinery designed not merely to punish rebellion, but to prevent opposition from gathering strength in the first place. Ironically, every new restriction produced an equal and opposite reaction. Educated Indians who had initially believed that constitutional petitions and polite requests would gradually persuade the British to grant greater rights began to lose faith in that approach. If peaceful criticism itself was treated as a crime, they reasoned, perhaps a stronger movement was a necessity. It was during this period that a new political organization emerged, one that would fundamentally change the nature of public protest in India. In 1885, a group of Indian leaders gathered in Bombay to establish the Indian National Congress. At first, their demands were remarkably modest. They did not ask for complete independence, they sought greater Indian participation in government, administrative reforms and equal treatment under the law. The British believed they could easily manage this new organization. They were about to discover that ideas, once awakened, are far more difficult to control than armies. And with the birth of the Congress, the protest in India would enter an entirely new phase. Not through rebellion, but through organized political action. That story begins in the next chapter. By the time the Indian National Congress was founded in Bombay in 1885, the British Empire had ruled large parts of India for nearly a century. Railways connected distant provinces. Telegraphs carried information at unprecedented speed. Universities had produced a growing class of educated Indians, and newspapers were creating a new public sphere where political ideas could be debated. For the first time in Indian history, people living hundreds of kilometers apart were beginning to think of themselves not merely as Bengalis, Punjabis, Tamils or Maharashtrians, but increasingly as Indians with common political interest. The Congress emerged from this changing India. Contrary to what many people believe today, the Congress did not begin as a revolutionary organization demanding independence. Its earliest leaders believed that the British Empire could be persuaded to reform itself. Men such as Dadabhai Naoroji, Surendranath Banerjee, Firoz Shah Mehta, Gopal Krishna Gokhale placed their faith in constitutional methods. They drafted petitions, passed resolutions, wrote detailed memoranda, and requested greater Indian participation in the administration. They demanded that the Indian civil service examination be made more accessible to Indians, criticized excessive taxation, highlighted the economic drain of wealth to Britain, and argued that educated Indians deserved a greater voice in governing their own country. To many young Indians, however, these methods appeared painfully slow. Year after year, petitions were submitted. Year after year, resolutions were passed, and year after year, British officials listened politely and then changed very little. This frustration was steadily growing, and then in 1905, the British government made a decision that transformed Indian politics forever. Lord Curzon announced the partition of Bengal, claiming that the province was too large to administer efficiently. Officially, it was presented as an administrative reform, and yet many Indians believed that the real objective was political, to divide the largely Bengali-speaking population along religious lines and weaken the growing nationalist movement. Whether one accepts that interpretation or not, there is little doubt that the announcement triggered an extraordinary public reaction. For the first time, protests ceased to be confined to educated elites and entered everyday life. People organized massive public meetings. Students marched through the streets. Merchants refused to sell British goods, and families began burning imported cloth in public bonfires. Instead of purchasing British textiles, Indians were encouraged to wear Swadeshi products manufactured within the country. What had begun as an opposition to a single administrative decision gradually evolved into a nationwide political movement. The Swadeshi movement introduced India to forms of protest that remain familiar even today. Economic boycotts, peaceful demonstrations, public speeches, symbolic acts of resistance, volunteer organizations, and mass mobilization all became part of the political vocabulary. Protest was no longer simply about expressing dissatisfaction, it had become an organized method of exerting pressure on the government. The British administration watched these developments with growing concern. Although many demonstrations were peaceful, officials feared that nationalist sentiment could eventually threaten imperial authority. Restrictions on public meetings became more frequent, newspapers faced prosecution, political activists were arrested, surveillance intensified across the country. And among those who came into direct conflict with the colonial government was Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Now, Tilak believed that political rights were never willingly granted by those in power. They had to be asserted by the people themselves. His famous declaration that Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it became one of the defining slogans of the freedom movement. Through his newspapers, the Kesari and the Maratha, he criticized British policies with remarkable boldness. The colonial government responded by prosecuting him for sedition, arguing that his writings encouraged disaffection against the British rule. Tilak was imprisoned, but his imprisonment only increased his popularity and inspired a new generation of nationalists. By the early 20th century, it had become clear that the relationship between the rulers and the ruled had fundamentally changed. The British possessed armies, courts, prisons, laws. The Indian people were discovering the power of organized public opinion. Neither side fully understood how powerful that force had become. Then in 1915, a lawyer returned to India after spending more than 2 decades in South Africa. He carried no weapons, he commanded no army, yet within a few years he would transform protests from the activity of political leaders into a movement involving millions of ordinary Indians. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, and with him the very meaning of protest would change forever. This Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi returned to India in January 1915. He was not yet the Mahatma that history remembers today. He had spent over 20 years in South Africa, where he had witnessed first-hand and racial discrimination faced by Indians living under colonial rule. During those years, he experimented with an entirely new method of political resistance, one that rejected both violent rebellion and passive submission. He called it Satyagraha, a Sanskrit word that roughly translates to holding firmly to the truth or the force of truth. At first glance, Satyagraha appeared deceptively simple. Instead of attacking the government with weapons, people would resist unjust laws by refusing to cooperate with them. They would accept arrest without retaliation, endure imprisonment without violence, and demonstrate that moral courage could be stronger than physical force. Many British officials dismissed the idea as impractical. History would prove them spectacularly wrong. Gandhi understood something that few political leaders before him had realized. Every government, however powerful, ultimately depends upon the cooperation of the people it governs. Taxes are collected because people pay them. Laws function because citizens obey them. Administrations work because millions of ordinary individuals participate in the system every single day. But what happens happens when millions of people decide peacefully and together that they will no longer cooperate with an unjust law? That question would redefine the Indian freedom struggle. Gandhi's first major experiment in India came in Champaran in 1917. Indigo farmers in Bihar had long been compelled to cultivate indigo under oppressive conditions imposed by European plantation owners. When Gandhi arrived, he did not encourage violent rebellion. Instead, he investigated their grievances, mobilized public opinion, and refused to leave despite official orders directing him to do so. The government eventually relented and appointed a committee to examine the farmers' complaints, leading to significant reforms. For many Indians, this was a revelation. A protest had forced the government to negotiate without a single shot being fired. Soon afterwards came the Kheda Satyagraha in Gujarat. Crop failure had devastated farmers, yet the colonial administration insisted on collecting land revenue. Gandhi argued that people who genuinely could not pay taxes should peacefully refuse to do so until justice was done. Once again, sustained non-violent resistance compelled the governments to grant relief. These early successes transformed Gandhi from a relatively unknown leader into a national figure. Yet, it was the events of 1919 that fundamentally altered the relationship between the British government and the Indian people. That year, the colonial administration enacted the Rowlatt Act, empowering authorities to detain individuals suspected of political activity without trial and placing several restrictions on civil liberties. To many Indians, it appeared that even the limited freedoms they possessed were now under direct attack. Gandhi called the nationwide hartal, urging people to suspend business and gather peacefully in protest. In several places, demonstrations remained peaceful. In others, violence broke out. Then came one of the darkest days in modern Indian history. On 13th of April 1919, thousands of men, women and children had assembled at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar. Some had to come to protest the Rowlatt Act, while many others had gathered simply because it was the festival of Baisakhi. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer entered the enclosed ground with armed soldiers and without warning the crowds to disperse, ordered his troops to open fire. The firing continued for several minutes. Official British figures reported hundreds of deaths. Indian estimates placed the number considerably higher, and the massacre shocked the nation. For millions of Indians, faith in British justice was shattered forever. The freedom movement entered an entirely new phase. In 1920, Gandhi launched the non-cooperation movement, asking Indians to withdraw their support from colonial institutions. Students left government schools, lawyers gave up their legal practices, people returned titles awarded by the British, and countless citizens refused to participate in institutions that they believed derived their legitimacy from unjust government. For perhaps the first time in history, protest became a truly mass movement involving ordinary people across villages, towns, and cities. The British administration responded with arrest on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of protesters were imprisoned. Gandhi himself was arrested. Yet each arrest seemed only to strengthen public determination. A decade later, Gandhi demonstrated the extraordinary symbolic power of peaceful protest once again. In 1930, he announced that he would march from Sabarmati Ashram to the coastal village of Dandi, a distance of nearly 390 kilometers, to challenge the British monopoly on salt. At first, many British officials mocked the idea. Salt seems too trivial to inspire a national movement. They misunderstood Gandhi's genius. Every Indian, rich or poor, needed salt. By choosing salt, Gandhi transformed an ordinary household necessity into a symbol of colonial injustice. As he walked from village to village, thousands joined him. When he finally picked up a handful of salt from the seashore in deliberate violation of British law, the act echoed around the world. The Salt March inspired millions of Indians to break colonial laws peacefully, and international newspapers carried images of unarmed protesters willingly facing police batons without retaliating. The moral authority of the British Empire suffered an immense damage. The final great mass movement came in 1942 when Gandhi launched the Quit India movement. This time, the British acted immediately, arresting Gandhi and almost the entire Congress leadership within hours. Although the movement witnessed episodes of violence in several places, Gandhi continued to insist that non-violence remained both a moral principle and the most effective political strategy. By the time India became independent in 1947, one fact had become impossible to ignore. The struggle for India's freedom had been won not merely on battlefields, but through marches, boycotts, strikes, public meetings, civil disobedience, and acts of peaceful resistance carried out by millions of ordinary people. When the leaders of independent India gathered to draft a constitution, they carried these memories with them. They had themselves organized protests, they had themselves been arrested, they had themselves experienced governments that feared dissent, and the question before them then was therefore profound. Should independent India merely replace British rulers with Indian rulers, or should it create a republic in which citizens would possess freedoms that even the government could not easily take away? That question would shape the Constitution of India, and it's there that the modern legal foundation of the right to protest truly begins. After suffering under the British restrictions and protests, did the makers of the Constitution give Indians a fundamental right to protest? The answer is yes and no, and that nuance is what makes the chapter interesting. When India became independent on the 15th of August 1947, the country celebrated the end of nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule. Yet independence raised a question which was far more difficult than driving the British out of India. What kind of nation would India become? Would the new Indian government inherit the same powers that the British government had enjoyed? Would it continue to suppress criticism in the name of maintaining order? Or would independent India be fundamentally different from the colonial state that millions of Indians had fought against? These are not merely political questions. They lay at the heart of the constitution that was being drafted by the Constituent Assembly. Many members of that assembly had themselves participated in protests against British rule. They had organized public meetings, published newspapers that challenged the government, addressed rallies, courted arrest, and spent months or even years in British prisons. They understood from personal experience what it meant to live under a government that feared dissent. It is therefore hardly surprising that when the Constituent Assembly began discussing fundamental rights, freedom occupied a central place in those debates. However, something very interesting happened. If you open the Constitution of India today and research for the word right to protest, you will not find it anywhere. There's no article that explicitly declares that every citizen has a fundamental right to protest. At first glance, this seems rather surprising. After all, India's freedom struggle has been built upon protests, marches, boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience. One might naturally expect the Constitution at least to contain an article to dedicate specifically to protecting this particular right. Instead, the framers adopted a different approach. They recognized that protest is not a single activity, it's actually a combination of several different freedoms, each of which deserves constitutional protection. And this is where Article 19 enters the story. Article 19 is often described as one of the pillars of Indian democracy because it guarantees several freedoms that together make a peaceful protest possible. The first is the freedom of speech and expression under Article 19(1)(a). Without the freedom to express disagreement with the government policies, the very idea of protest would become meaningless. The second is the right to assemble peacefully and without arms under Article 19(1)(b). This allows citizens to gather together in public instead of expressing their views only as isolated individuals. The third right is the right to form associations or unions under Article 19(1)(c). Every organization that leads a protest, whether it's a students' union, a farmers' association, a labor union, or a civil society organization, relies upon this constitutional protection. Taken together, these three freedoms create what we commonly describe as the right to protest, even though those exact words never appear in the Constitution itself. The distinction is extremely important because it helps us to understand how Indian constitutional law actually works. The Constitution protects the individual freedom that makes peaceful protest possible. It does not create an unlimited license to protest in any manner, at any place, or under any circumstance. The members of the Constituent Assembly were deeply committed to liberty, but they were equally aware that they were building a nation that had just witnessed partition, communal violence, refugee crisis, and enormous political instability. They therefore recognized another equally important principle: every freedom carries responsibility. A citizen's freedom cannot completely destroy another citizen's freedom. One person's right to express an opinion cannot automatically justify preventing thousands of others from reaching hospitals, schools, workplaces, or their homes. This balancing exercise became one of the defining features of the Indian Constitution. It explains why the Constitution guarantees freedom with one hand while allowing carefully defined restrictions with the other. This was not seen as a contradiction. It was seen as a necessity for governing a democratic society of extraordinary size and diversity. The challenge, however, lay in determining whether that balance should be drawn. How much restriction is reasonable? When does maintaining public order become suppression of dissent? And can the government deny permission for a protest before it even begins? Can roads be occupied indefinitely? Can internet services be suspended during demonstrations? Can protesters be arrested merely because they disagree with the government policy? These questions could not be answered by the Constitution alone. They would eventually reach the Supreme Court of India, where judges spent decades interpreting the meaning of liberty, public order, and democracy itself. And it is in those judgments that the modern legal understanding of the right to protest truly begins to take shape. The Constitution gave India the foundations for the right to protest. It was the Supreme Court that spent the next 7 decades deciding what those words actually meant in practice. Every generation produced new forms of protest. Every government faced fresh challenges to its authority, and every few years another dispute would arrive before the court asking essentially the same question: where does constitutional liberty end and government authority begin? Unlike Parliament, which makes laws, or the executive, which enforces them, the Supreme Court performs a different constitutional function. It interprets the Constitution itself. Consequently, whenever citizens believed that governments had imposed unreasonable restrictions upon their freedoms, or whenever governments argued that public order required limitations upon those freedoms, it was ultimately the judiciary that was asked to reconcile these competing constitutional claims. One of the earliest opportunities for the court to consider this issue arose in Kameshwar Prasad versus State of Bihar, and the dispute concerned a rule that completely prohibited government employees from participating in any demonstration whatsoever. The state argued that such a prohibition was necessary to preserve discipline within the public service. The Supreme Court, however, refused to accept such an absolute restriction and held that while governments may regulate demonstrations in appropriate circumstances, they cannot simply prohibit peaceful demonstrations altogether, because peaceful expression of opinion forms part of the constitutional freedoms guaranteed under Article 19. This judgment established an important principle that continues to influence Indian constitutional law even today. Peaceful protest cannot be treated as though it was inherently unlawful. The court returned to this subject once again in another case, which remains highly relevant today. Could the state simply refuse citizen access to every public street for the purpose of holding meetings? The Supreme Court answered in negative. It recognized that public streets belong to the public and that citizens possess the constitutional right to hold public meetings upon them, subject of course to reasonable regulation intended to ensure safety, traffic management, and public convenience. At the same time, the court also clarified that this does not mean that every road could be occupied indefinitely or without administrative control. Governments retained the authority to regulate the manner in which the public spaces were used, but they could not exercise that authority arbitrarily or in a way that effectively destroyed the underlying constitutional freedom. The tension between liberty and public order became even more visible during the decades that followed. Particularly as protests grew larger and media coverage became more immediate, the emergence of 24-hour news channels, followed later by social media platforms, transformed local demonstrations into national events within a matter of hours. Governments increasingly found themselves balancing not only the constitutional rights of protesters but also the rights of millions of other citizens affected by prolonged demonstrations. One of the most significant judgments in this regard arose from the events at Ram Leela Maidan in Delhi in 2011. Thousands of supporters had gathered for a protest led by Baba Ramdev, but during the night the police entered the venue and dispersed the assembly. The incident generated widespread public debate and eventually reached the Supreme Court. While recognizing that the government possesses the responsibility of maintaining law and order, the court strongly criticized the excessive use of force against a peaceful gathering and reaffirmed that the freedoms guaranteed under Article 19 could not be curtailed in a manner that was arbitrary or disproportionate. The judgment emphasizes that in a constitutional democracy, the state must exercise restraint even while performing its duty of preserving public order. Perhaps no recent case illustrates the modern constitutional dilemma more clearly than Amit Sahni versus Commissioner of Police, decided in 2020 against the backdrop of the Shaheen Bagh protesters. The protest had become one of the defining political events of contemporary India, with demonstrators occupying a major public road in Delhi for the extended period. Supporters regarded the occupation as a powerful symbol of democratic resistance, while critics argued that the prolonged blockade imposed an unacceptable burden upon ordinary commuters and residents. When the matter reached the Supreme Court, the judges acknowledged that a peaceful protest is undoubtedly a constitutional right flowing from Article 19. At the same time, however, they observed that public ways and public spaces cannot be occupied indefinitely because constitutional rights belong not only to those who protest but also to those whose daily lives depend upon the continued accessibility of public infrastructure. The judgment therefore attempted to balance two competing constitutional claims rather than treating either as absolute. If someone were to ask a simple question, do Indians have the right to protest? The simple answer would be yes. But as we have discovered over the course of this journey, constitutional law is rarely satisfied with simple answers. The more accurate answer is that every citizen possesses a constitutional right to express dissent, to assemble peacefully and to organize collectively. But the exercise of those freedoms exists within a constitutional framework that attempts to reconcile liberty with the equally important interest of public order, public safety, and the right of all citizens. It is this balance, rather than an unlimited freedom or an unlimited governmental authority, that lies at the heart of the Indian constitutional system. This conclusion is hardly accidental. It reflects the extraordinary historical journey that India has travelled over the last several centuries. Ancient India certainly recognized that rulers should listen to the grievances of their subjects, but it did not conceive of dissent as a legally enforceable right against the state. The East India Company, driven primarily by commercial interests, viewed resistance as an obstacle to be suppressed rather than a constitutional freedom to be respected. The British Crown inherited that approach after 1858 and gradually developed an elaborate legal machinery, including sedition laws, restrictions on public meetings, surveillance, and censorship, to ensure that organized political opposition remained under control. Ironically, these very restrictions produced one of the greatest protest movements in modern history, as millions of Indians under leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi transformed peaceful civil disobedience into the principal weapon of the freedom struggle. When India became independent, the framers of the constitution consciously rejected the colonial assumption that dissent was inherently dangerous. They had themselves marched in protest, addressed public meetings, faced imprisonment, and experienced the consequences of arbitrary executive power. Consequently, they chose to build a constitutional order in which criticism of the government would not merely be tolerated but protected as an essential feature of democratic life. At the same time, however, they also recognized that independent India would face challenges entirely different from those encountered during a freedom struggle. A democratic government bears responsibilities that a constitutional administration never claimed to possess. It must maintain law and order, protect public infrastructure, safeguard the lives of citizens, and ensures that the right of one group do not extinguish the right of another. It was this recognition that led them to permit reasonable restrictions upon the exercise of fundamental freedoms. Over the decades, the Supreme Court has repeatedly reaffirmed this constitutional philosophy. The judiciary has consistently rejected the notion that governments may silence peaceful criticism merely because it's inconvenient to politically uncomfortable, while at the same time refusing to endorse the proposition that every form of protest, regardless of its consequences, enjoys constitutional protection. Instead, the court has attempted, often under difficult and politically charged circumstances, to preserve the delicate equilibrium envisioned by the Constitution, reminding governments that restrictions must always remain reasonable, proportionate, and legally justifiable, while reminding citizens that constitutional rights carry corresponding responsibilities towards the society as a whole. This means that a peaceful march, a public meeting, a sit-in demonstration conducted in accordance with lawful regulations, the carrying of placards, the raising of slogans, the submission of petitions, and the public criticism of government policies all fall squarely within the democratic traditions that the Constitution seeks to preserve. Equally, however, acts involving violence, destruction of public property, indefinite occupation of essential public infrastructure, intimidation of other citizens, or obstruction of emergency services may lawfully invite government intervention, not because dissent itself is prohibited, but because the Constitution protects the rights of all citizens and not merely those participating in a particular protest. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire story is that the debate has never truly ended. Every generation confronts the circumstances that the previous generation could scarcely have imagined. Today, a protest may be organized through social media posts viewed by millions within a few hours. Demonstrations can spread across multiple cities almost simultaneously. Governments possess surveillance technologies and communication tools unavailable even a few decades ago, while citizens have unprecedented access to digital platforms through which they can mobilize public opinion on a national scale. Questions concerning internet shutdowns, online mobilizations, facial recognition technologies, preventive detention, and digital surveillance are now becoming as significant to the constitutional conversation as newspapers, public meetings, and street processions were during the 20th century. The Constitution itself has not changed dramatically in this regard, but the circumstance in which it operates certainly have, and the courts continue to adapt constitutional principles to new realities. Ultimately, therefore, the right to protest is not simply a legal doctrine contained within Article 19, nor is it merely a collection of judicial precedents scattered across decades of constitutional litigation. It represents something much larger. It reflects the belief that the legitimacy of a democratic government does not arise from its ability to silence disagreement, but from its willingness to govern in the presence of disagreement. Democracies do not become stronger because every citizen agrees with those in power. They become stronger because citizens are free to question authority while government remains bound by the Constitution in responding to that criticism. If there's one lesson that emerges from this long historical journey, from the assemblies of ancient India to the indigo fields of Champaran to the tragedy of Jallianwala Bagh to the debates of Constituent Assembly and the courtrooms of the Supreme Court to the streets of contemporary India, it is that the history of the right to protest has never been a struggle between the state and the people alone. It has always been a search for the equilibrium between authority and liberty, between governance and dissent, between order and freedom, and that search continues even today because every democracy must continuously redefine where that balance ought to lie.